First, a word about the title, The Great Task Remaining Before Us. Many years ago, when I was still quite new to ministry, I attended regular monthly meetings of my fellow Unitarian Universalist clergy. And I remember one meeting where the conversation turned to the topic of sermon titles, whether they should be used at all, and if they were used, how they could be made snappy and attractive. You might say how they could have that sizzle. Some colleagues felt strongly that sermon titles should never be publicized, citing for support a story about William Ellery Channing, the so-called father of American Unitarianism, walking down Newbury Street in Boston on his way to church one fine Sunday morning 200 years ago. He spotted the president of his congregation on the opposite sidewalk, headed in the other direction. So quickly crossing over the brick pavement, Channing asked politely where his parishioner was going. "Oh, I read your sermon title in the newspaper and I wasn't interested in the topic, so I decided to take a walk in the Commons." From that day on, the story goes, Channing never again posted his sermon titles in advance. His reasoning, and that of my colleagues who followed this practice, was that people should be coming to worship together in community regardless of the topic, or of the preacher for that matter. Other members of our clergy group felt equally strongly that a well-crafted and catchy sermon title could serve to pique the interest of a casual newspaper reader or passerby, or today a internet browser, and so serve an evangelical function. One of my older colleagues then suggested an all-purpose sermon title that would be suitable for any occasion, especially when you weren't quite sure what you wanted to preach about. "The great task remaining before us," he advised, would serve admirably in any situation. It sounds vaguely inspirational, almost Lincoln-esque, but it leaves the subject matter entirely open. And that's where I was a few weeks ago when I had to put something in the newsletter. The truth be told, I've resorted to that device a few times over the years and decided to use it again. But I think it fits today because it turns out that healing the heart of democracy is the great task remaining before us as citizens and as members of this religious community, as people of faith concerned for the common good. Democracy is an integral part of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. It says it right there on the wall. It's our fifth principle. We affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in society at large. Democracy is not merely an instrumental or procedural value, it's a substantive good. It's not just a tool, a more or less effective means for achieving some desired goal, getting a better deal for ourselves, for example. Democracy is, for Unitarian Universalists, an intrinsic value. It is inherently valuable as an expression of the essential, inalienable worth and dignity of each person. We take democracy very seriously. We take it religiously. It's a core principle, and it was itself arrived at democratically. I remember well the discussions in the early 1980s when these principles were being discussed and debated and voted upon democratically. There was much vigorous discussion about the word process versus the original text, which read the democratic method. I remember to this day, people felt very strongly, some people felt that method suggested a kind of technical, application that democracy was rather a process than some method or technique. And that's the wording that ended up in there, was process. There is no one democratic technique, despite not even Robert's Rules of Order. You've probably heard the old joke that, Jews have the Torah, the Muslims have the Quran, Protestants have the Bible, Catholics have the Pope, Unitarians have Robert's Rules of Order. And we do have that, and we do use that as a way of structuring this process. Democracy is more than counting heads or hands. It's more than majority rule. It's an ongoing conversation. And that conversation helps to shape the questions and the issues and the values and the things that matter. I think it's important that the right of conscience is mentioned precisely here in the context or in connection with the processes of democracy. That right of conscience is always in creative tension with majority rule. Dick Gilbert, a wonderful social activist minister, now retired, tells a story about this principle. When he was the minister in Rochester, Vermont, they had a vote in the 1980s on the nuclear freeze, and the vote passed by a count of 156 to 1. And Gilbert, everyone knew who the one person was, a beloved matriarch of the church, a conservative politically. And Dick Gilbert wrote an article in the newsletter. He said, "It takes courage to vote one's conviction when it is clear one is going to be a small minority. Yet it is crucial to the process that this voice be heard. The minority, even of one, reminds the majority that conscience counts for something in liberal religion." This voice helps keep the majority from becoming arrogant and self-righteous. We needed that vote, he said, for the good of all. A member of a congregation I formerly served used to like to announce to visitors on Sunday morning, "Whatever is on your bumper sticker, you're welcome here." And I often wondered if we lived up to that ideal. If we did, or if we even come close to moving in that direction, it's because we take seriously the right of conscience and we learn the skills of deep democracy, the radical spiritual discipline of listening with respect and openness, of speaking one's truth honestly and fearlessly, and of working for the good of the whole while respecting the rights of the minority. Democracy, then, is, if you take it seriously, a religious value and a spiritual practice. And like all spiritual practices, it requires discipline. There are skills to learn which can be mastered only in their actual exercise. And religious congregations and fellowships are good places to practice those democratic skills. That's why this principle begins with, in our congregations. Starting with ourselves. Of course, it's entirely possible to practice religion in a non-democratic, indeed an authoritarian manner. History is filled with examples of authoritarian religious leaders marching lockstep with anti-democratic, even totalitarian political regimes, legitimating their rule while mirroring and mimicking within their own communities those same abusive practices of power. But it has also been the case, historically, that religious communities can become crucibles of political creativity, seedbeds of democracy, experimental laboratories where new ways of imagining and actualizing life together can happen. This was the case in 17th century England when Puritan congregations pioneered parliamentary and proto-democratic forms of governance within their local congregations, which were later extended to the wider society. Puritans, I know, get a lot of bad press, some of it well-deserved, but they were innovators and incubators in their own time who helped shape the emergence of modern democracy. Churches were also important incubators of democracy in the late 18th century when the founders of this nation fashioned a political system that owed much to the values derived from religious ideas and practices, including significantly those of our Unitarian and Universalist forebears. And certainly in the 1960s, the struggle for civil rights found much of its motivation and its sustaining power in religious communities, particularly the Black churches. It is this religious heritage that we are lifting up when we say that we affirm and promote the rights of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Parker Palmer speaks of the need for a politics of the broken heart. Hearts can break in two ways, though. They can break apart or they can break open. There's a wonderful Jewish midrash on a verse in Deuteronomy that talks about placing these words of the Torah upon your heart. And one student asked the rabbi, why does that say upon your hearts? And he said, that is so when your heart breaks, the holy words will fall inside. As Cohen reminds us, the heart has got to open in a fundamental way. Terry Tempest Williams, the environmental activist, puts it this way: the human heart is the first home of democracy. It is where we embrace our questions. Can we be equitable? Can we be generous? Can we listen with our whole beings, not just our minds, and offer our attention rather than our opinions? And do we have enough resolve in our hearts to act courageously, relentlessly, without giving up, ever trusting our fellow citizens to join with us in our determined pursuit of a living democracy? Sounds a bit like Higgins. I'm reminded of another song by Leonard Cohen called The Guests, which begins with these lines. One by one, the guests arrive. The guests are coming through. The broken-hearted many, the open-hearted few. So what if you want to be one of those open-hearted few? You want to take this principle seriously and see democracy not just as a political technique, but as a spiritual practice. What are some things you could do, we could do? Within our congregations, I would invite all of you to participate in our own democratic governance. Listen, speak up to share your perception of the opportunities and the challenges that face us. This means that we have to be continually learning together, balancing our confident advocacy with humble inquiry. Democracy requires conversation, but it's a very particular kind of conversation, disciplined, honest, informed, and always with the larger good in mind. It's more dialogue than debate. And these are all skills that can be practiced, from committee meetings to covenant groups to coffee hours. 21st century congregations, if we are to be incubators of new ways of imagining community, will look different from those earlier examples. But there's much creative ferment in congregational life today that we need to participate in. What about then reaching out through the congregation to society at large? And of course, voting, which we just finished, is one of the very important and very focused form of democratic participation, but it's not the whole story. What does democracy look like after the election? And that's where it is our job, our responsibility to give feedback to elected officials, local, state, and national. More than one politician, many more than one politician, has said to me, you would be appalled to learn how few people communicate with us when we're in office. Democracy is about much more than voting, then, as important as that is. A very sobering perspective was provided in a 2014 report by Benjamin Page and Martin Gillens, who are political scientists at Northwestern University and Princeton University. Their findings were published in an article called Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens. Not a very sizzling title, but it was a profound, powerful report which compiled data from about 1,800 different policy initiatives in the years between 1981 and 2002, and they compared those policy changes with the expressed opinions of the United States public. And I'll just cut to the chase. They say the preference of the average American appears to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. In other words, their statistics say your opinion literally does not matter. Maybe Higgins' friends were right, or were they? In an interview, Gillens elaborated by saying, I'd say that contrary to what decades of political science research might lead you to believe, ordinary citizens have virtually no influence over what their government does in the United States. Economic elites and interest groups, especially those representing business, have a substantial degree of influence. This is not a surprise, but it's enough to break your heart. It's enough to break my heart. But it's not enough to prevent me from continuing that discipline of spiritual discipline of democratic process. Are we just drops in the bucket? Not necessarily. The most important part of the story about our friend Higgins was when he decided to talk to his friends. That's the most important part of the story. And also when the friends later decided to look around and started to talk about what they saw in their deteriorating environment. Those conversations, that's the point of the story. The open-hearted conversations are where true democracy begins and where the possibility of healing and restoration begins. And we have to get back to that basic practice, to engage in dialogue about the issues that break our hearts. And finally, one last thing I will say is you might consider running for office yourself. You know, I've seen that happen, and we need more, I think, more representatives from our communities in public life. Writing over a century ago to a friend, the philosopher William James declared, "I am done with great things and big things, great institutions and big success. And I am for those tiny, invisible, molecular moral forces that work from individual to individual, creeping through the crannies of the world like so many rootlets or like the capillary oozing of water, yet which, if you give them time, will rend the hardest monuments of man's pride." I love that quote from James. I think Higgins would agree, those capillary oozings of water. Those of us who affirm and promote the value of democracy have our work cut out for us. The great work remaining before us is also always nurturing the seeds of new life in beloved community. We are, in the words of the poet Richard Blanco, we are each other's shelter and hope. And I'd like to conclude this service this sermon with a reading. Actually, I've asked some people to come up maybe to the microphone and share this reading with me, and we'll go from this into our closing hymn.